welcome to the Trauma Treatment Collective vlog. Today we're going to be talking about boundaries, but before we talk about boundaries, I want to talk about last week's vlog where I talked about where to start in trauma treatment. I talked about a concept that I got from somatic experiencing when I was training in somatic experiencing, and it's a trauma timeline, and I talk about how it's important to work from the edges into the most traumatic part of the trauma. And so I want you to go back if you haven't had a chance to watch that, and I really would encourage you to check it out and take some time and look at it, because it's a really interesting concept of how do we work from the edges to the inside of a traumatic event. And a lot of times clients want to work from the inside to the edges, and we really want to take them from the edges to the inside. So I would encourage you to go back and check that out. I'll link it down in the description section for you to get to easily, but yeah, check it out when you can. So let's get to today. Today is all about boundaries and when it's important and why it's important for us to have boundaries as well as for our clients to have boundaries. So when I talk about boundaries, I always like to start with psychoeducation about boundaries, and I'm going to share with you my psychoeducation spill that I give to my clients about boundaries. I talk about boundaries as kind of like a 3D spear, and on that spear there's holes within that spear, and those holes are representative of spaces for things to go in that are good for us and that are pleasant to us, and things to be expelled out that are harmful or dangerous to us. And so boundaries have this ability, this fluidity that they have, where things can come in and things can go out. And so when you're thinking about boundaries, you're thinking about this space that I've created that has the flexibility to let things in that are pleasant for me and to expel things out that are unpleasant for me. I talk about 3 specific types of boundaries that we might have. One is rigid boundaries, where nothing goes in, nothing goes out. It's kind of like this solid kind of wall experience that people have. Who's inside the boundary, that's who I talk to, that's who I deal with, that's who I interact with. And who's outside of the boundary, I do not talk to them, I do not interact with them. And so there's this very rigid kind of way of doing life and doing relationships. Then I talk about the leaky boundary, where things are coming in and going out, and there's so many holes in the boundary and so many broken spots in the boundary that things are going in and out, and we have no control and we have no knowledge sometimes of things coming in and out because we can't keep track of all of the holes that are in our boundary. And then I talk about the area where there's no boundaries at all. So there's an absence of boundaries. And so things can come in, go out, no problem, nothing, it's fine. And so that's absence of boundaries. And so those are the 3 boundaries that I really introduce to my clients. And usually as I go through that spill, they're able to kind of think about, how do I do relationship? How do I interact with people? And they're able to kind of identify which boundary kind of fits for them. And once they're able to identify that, then we start to talk about how can we move to a more healthier boundary. So if one of those unhealthy boundary types fit for them, so that's the rigid, leaky, or no boundaries at all, then how can we move them towards boundaries in a healthy manner? I always talk about boundaries are very fluid. They change depending on the situation, circumstances, who you're interacting with. You have different boundaries for different situations and different people. And I make sure that clients know that. And I think that's something important to say today as well. The boundary that I have for my significant other is going to be different than the boundary I have for my, let's say, boss, or the boundary I have for my neighbor may be different than the boundary I have for a stranger that I've never talked to or never met before. And so as I interact with different people in different situations and different environments, my boundaries will be different. When I see my clients out in public, I interact with them different than I would if I saw them in my office. So as you think about that, just really encouraging them to pay attention to what boundaries come up for them, how they feel, how they interact with people based on where they're at in the situation and the circumstances. So as they're working with those boundaries, I want you to also be thinking about, well, what type of boundary do I have with my clients? Is it healthy, where I'm taking things in that are pleasant for me and expelling things out? Is it rigid, where I'm like, nope, you sit here, I sit there, we don't interact, we don't connect, we don't do anything? Sometimes I've seen where therapists are kind of very rigid in their boundaries. And then, or is it leaky, where you're just saying stuff and talking and chatting and telling all about too much and talking too much about your personal life and what's going on, so things are coming in and going out and moving all over the place? Or is there no boundary at all? Like there's no significant identifiers that you're the therapist and they're the client. I think it's really important as we are working with clients that we have healthy boundaries, because we want to model healthy boundaries for them, and we want them to be able to move into that and be able to take that out into their day-to-day interactions so that they can have healthy boundaries. A lot of times when trauma is involved, trauma can sometimes rupture boundaries or damage boundaries and cause those boundaries to develop into unhealthy boundaries. So maybe people had healthy boundaries, trauma came in, ruptured a boundary, and that client didn't get the chance to repair that boundary in a healthy way, so it just kind of healed in a very unhealthy way. And the unhealthy way, again, is rigid boundaries, leaky boundaries, or no boundaries at all. So as you're thinking about that, I think that's important to kind of provide that psychoeducation to clients. Now, as you're thinking about yourself as the therapist, I like to talk about this idea of holding space, creating a container for your client to do the trauma work. And I think in order to hold space for clients, you really have to have a clear sense of where they begin and where you end. And then there needs to be a space in between that where the work is done. A lot of times we think when we're working with clients that we have to kind of take on what they're carrying or what they're dealing with or what they're processing through. And that's the most furthest thing from the truth, because that creates risk for vicarious trauma, post-secondary trauma, burnout, compassion fatigue, all of those things. When we start to carry our clients' load, it is not our load to carry, it's their load to carry. And we can't carry all of our clients' stuff because we have multiple clients. Imagine carrying all of their stuff and feeling all of their feelings and being in the process with them and just being overwhelmed by them. And so that's when we're at risk for burnout and things like that. And so I really think it's important that we work to have a space in between our clients where I know where I am, I know where they are, and we have this space that we create in the therapy room to do the work, to process. And then we know how to kind of leave that space there at the therapy room. And so when I'm thinking about it, I think about, okay, so if my client's sitting on a chair across from me and I'm sitting on a chair across from them, then there's this space in between us. And that's the space we do the work. I never bring that stuff into me, and I never expect them or hope that they learn to start putting that stuff in that space versus carrying it with them all the time. They're able to do the hard work, touch into the hard things, but also learn to be regulated and learn to be stabilized in their day-to-day life. And they're not carrying all of that intense stuff with them throughout their day and those kinds of things. That takes time in the process. It's not something that a client can do right when they come into therapy, but that's the goal, is that we create this space and this container that holds the work that we do, and they don't have to carry it, I don't have to carry it, no one has to carry it. It can stay in this container and we can work on it, and then they can kind of leave it there and move on with the rest of their life and kind of see things in a different way and experience things in a different way. So that's something I want you guys to think about as a therapist. Like, how am I working to create this container or this space in between me and my client so I'm not carrying in this stuff from day to day? I have to have healthy boundaries with the work that I'm doing, because a lot of times we do develop compassion and empathy for our clients. And so it's easy to find ourselves kind of taking on their experience, especially when they're not doing well, especially when they're struggling and they're having a really hard time. It's easy to kind of get in there and really have kind of more of a leaky kind of boundary experience or a no boundary experience, where we start actually doing the work for them versus them doing the work for themselves, and us creating this container or this holding space for them to do the work in, that's very safe and very secure and very supportive of them, but not actually getting in there and doing the work. So I want you guys to think about that. So one is provide psychoeducation for your clients, really helping them to understand what boundaries are. And I kind of share with you how I do that. And then the second thing is to really work as the therapist to create this space in this container and not taking on our client's stuff, but really having healthy boundaries with the work that we're doing and how we interact with our clients. Hopefully this is helpful for you. Hopefully you can take something away from this vlog that you can use in your day-to-day practice. I would love to hear comments in the comment section. If you have thoughts about boundaries and how you introduce boundaries to your clients, or questions that you may have about boundaries, or maybe how you as a therapist can maintain healthier boundaries with your client. I'm always here to support. The Trauma Treatment Collective is here to kind of help you to grow and develop your skills, as well as support you in your trauma treatment journey. So subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you'll know when the next video comes out or the next vlog comes out. And until then, take care, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.